Okay, listen, now I'm going to introduce a panel. You kind of by now will know the format, but just so that you know, everybody gets 5 to 6 minutes each, and then I come out to the audience. Anyone who wants to speak, I take groups of 3, 4, 5 people, come back to the panel, out and so on. I can't tell you how excited I am to have Joe Phoenix here, because it's the first time that this famous now Professor of Criminology is speaking at the battle. She entered the gender wars, or, you know, fighting and screaming, in 2018 when she was cancelled by the University of Essex and then harassed and discriminated against by colleagues, then constructively dismissed by the Open University. But she won. She won her case. And that's also what I mean is, you know, should we be celebrating the wins rather than moaning? You know, that's like part of it. But Joe, the thing that's really annoying, and this is one of the things that drives me mad about the gender wars, is that Joe is an incredibly important voice in criminology. And I know it sounds ridiculous, but I want to invite her on panel to discuss criminology and not to discuss the gender wars. A lot of people have got better things to do with their life than getting dragged into this, dragged down by it. So that's something to bear in mind. We're then going to hear from Simon Calvert. Simon is the Deputy Director of the Christian Institute. Now, over recent years particularly, I've often been accused of being in cahoots with Christian evangelicals, especially American ones. The thing that's problematic for me is that whilst I'm not religious, it is true that I'm sort of in cahoots with Simon, right? And that's because Simon has been an invaluable advisor on bills and legislation in this space, and is also somebody who's been very sensitive to the assaults on freedom of speech and freedom of conscience as a Christian institute, as you'd imagine. But it is important because how come I've ended up as an ally of Simon Calvert? Why is Simon Calvert sitting next to Joe Phoenix? What the hell's going on there, right? And that's what I mean about it. It's all a bit odd. Then we've got Fiona McAnena, who last year spoke when she was Director of Sport at Fair Play for Women, and is now back as Director of Campaigns for Sex Matters. I think that Sex Matters has become one of the most influential organisations that's emerged in recent years. I love the fact that Fiona won a rowing blue at Cambridge and still rows competitively and is a keen park runner. But as is the way of life, if you're a keen park runner, that doesn't mean you go out and run in parks. It means you're dragged into the gender wars because the park run has become a subject of that. But the issues around sport in particular have become an intensive and carry on being a source of great tension, I think. Anyway, I'm delighted Fiona's joining us. We're then going to hear from Bev Jackson, the co-founder and trustee of that internationally renowned hate organisation, the LGB Alliance. It is actually very important that we hear from Bev and from the LGB Alliance because of the particular challenges, I think, that the gender wars have presented, especially to young lesbians and gay people. And the whole issues around regret, detransitioning and all the rest of it also come into this space. But when I made that joke about the hate organisation, it's actually significant, this, because for being an organisation that wants to represent and help lesbian, gay and bisexual people, and particularly young, and setting up helplines and all the rest of it, they have been dubbed hate mongers. They've been targeted. They've been harassed. They've been taken to court. I mean, how mad is that? Progressive 2024, representing lesbians and gays and bisexual people, and you're called hate mongers. So that's a weird situation we've got into. However, the courts did not find against them. They are not a hate group. It's a load of nonsense. We're delighted to have Bev with us. And then finally, we're going to hear from Stephen Knight, who's a reporter and writer and host of The Night Tube, which is, and Stephen and his colleague are going to do a live podcast tomorrow late afternoon, interviewing Rosie Kay, and also a well-known MP in this space. Yes, Rosie, I know it wasn't, I've forgotten her name, I thought I'd need to say it. Right, Rosie, who's late to the programme, but we're delighted. Stephen was actually on the same panel at the Buxton Battle of Ideas last year with Simon. And if you know anything about Stephen's podcast, you know, it's religiously secular, if I can put it that way. Right? Fair. They couldn't be further apart on paper, politically probably. And yet actually both of them gave a really good account of themselves on that panel. I'm delighted to have got them back and to have reunited them. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to hear from all these people. This is a serious session. It's not intended to be where we all agree with each other. It's a real genuine discussion about whether we're overdoing it, over-exaggerating what faces us, what we think next, and so on and so forth. So be thinking all the time when you're listening to them, what do you want to ask? Do you want to challenge? Don't feel you have to agree, and so on and so forth. So give a warm welcome to Jo to start off.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I might stand up because when I'm short, I can't even see at the back of the room. So I wanted to start off saying a small thing, and that's that I don't know that the formulation of this moment in time called gender wars is actually the correct formulation. I don't think it is. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that I think the formulation of it as a gender war, and the war metaphor, is wrong. And I think that because one of the problems that we have when we start talking about culture wars or cancel culture or gender wars is that it makes it out that this is just an ideological tussle. It's just a tussle about ideas. And I think there are far deeper economic, social, and political forces that we're dealing with. And I say all of this by saying thank you for calling me a criminologist, but I only identify as one. I'm actually a sociologist at heart. So I'm going to return to my essential state at this point and give what is more of a sociological set of thoughts. So what are these deeper economic, social, and political forces that I think that we're dealing with? There are, for those of you who are aware of some of this literature, our kind of capitalism, the system that we live in at the moment, is not a system of production anymore. It's a system of consumption. And it's a particular type of system of consumption. It's one that valorizes the individual. And within a consumerist, neoliberal economic structure, what we have is that the individual and how they can express their unique individuality is what reigns supreme. So it came as no surprise to me that by the time we get to the mid-2010s, what we have is I can never say those words. It's an allergic reaction, I think. That we have trans ideology running rampant. And we have that because it is the one supreme way that an individual can express who they are. Now, I don't mean in that sense of saying this is my subjectivity and this is who I am. What is involved in a trans individual expressing their unique gendered sense involves money, markets, brands. It involves a deeply economic act. We know the economics of trans medicine. We know the pharmaceutical companies are minting it off this, quite frankly. So we know that there are some deeper economic forces at play. I'm going to skip over some of those because it is like pure sociology, and although I geek out on it, you might not. But I also think that we're at a moment, and 2010 was really quite a year for me, not to do with trans stuff, but to do with watching what happens to women in the criminal justice system. And it dawned on me then, and this is not new, I think Julie, are you in the room somewhere? Julie Bindel has been charting this for decades now, along with these shifts in consumer capitalism, what we also see is the re-entrenchment of sex-based inequalities. And you don't have to look far to find them. You can just look at all the objective measures that we have for measuring equality. So we know, for instance, that the sort of social changes that the Sex Discrimination Act of 1975 issued in about pay equality, we know that's in reverse. Women are getting paid roughly 72% of what men are getting paid. That was how it was in 1975, right? So we haven't really progressed there. We know that we haven't really progressed where it comes to the burden of childcare and domestic labor for women. We know that women's reproductive rights and health is in reverse. And I won't get started on violence against women, beyond saying that from 2010 onwards, what we've seen is an absolute 100% crisis in the legitimacy of how we police and deal with violence against women. I only have to mention the name Sarah Everard for this to kind of be driven home. We know that women in prison, whereas once, when I started my career as a criminologist in 1997, there were less than 2,000 women in prison. And in fact, only a few years prior to that, there were less than 1,000 women in prison. And it was perfectly possible to argue for the abolition of women's imprisonment because so few were there. Now we've got around 5,000 women in prison. So those markers are going in the reverse. And we know that women's incarceration is often, if not solely, a result of poverty. So that kind of economic inequalities links to what happens in terms of crime and justice. And then to accompany some of these changes, this re-entrenchment of sex-based inequalities, we have this new ideology that everyone can be a woman. Now, those of us who have long tooths or long years in the battle of feminism, we know that woman was always a political category. We know, for instance, that when we defined women, we might define ourselves as female, but defining ourselves as women in that way was a political act. And at least within feminism, that political category wasn't colonized until just recently. And of course now what we say, when people say, yeah, but women is a political category, that means men can be women, which I'm sorry, that's a perversion of it. So combined with shifting notions around sex, gender, and identity, we also have a social ideological shift towards sexual libertarianism. Julie Bindel has been writing about this, and for most of her life, and it's something that I personally have taken an interest in, and that's this idea that we're now in this progressive state where anything goes. There are no moral boundaries anymore, because the idea of sexual morality is something that was bad from the bad old days. So I'm going to move swiftly on because I've talked too much. And I think all I want to say here, I'll just flip this down, is this. The problem with the metaphor of it being a gender war is that it implies that there is some state we can get to where we win. And I don't think we ever can, because what we're talking about is a constant struggle for justice. And those social conditions won't change by each one of us winning these legal battles. I'm very pleased I won my legal battle, but guess what? The OU isn't going to change, and it doesn't have to change, right? They just had to pay me money. So I think this kind of notion of a battle, particularly where it's tied to legal reform, is perhaps a misnomer. We need to start thinking about the struggle for justice.
Thank you very much. That was genuinely challenging and interesting, and giving us a lot to think about as a good start. Thank you very much, Simon.
So in 2002, I got a phone call from a church in South Wales. They had somebody attending the church for a year who was a man presenting as a woman. The fact that he'd been at the church for a year tells you that clearly they'd been pretty good at welcoming him. But he wanted them to let him use the women's toilets, and he wanted them to let him attend the women's meetings. They said no. So he sued them. He sued them with the help of the Equal Opportunities Commission, the statutory body responsible for women's rights. We won the case. We helped the church, and we won the case because, he didn't have a leg to stand on legally. But the judge used the opportunity to berate the church. And when you win a case, you get your costs ordered. He ordered costs against the church for winning the case. It was super weird. And that was when I first started to sort of see what we now recognise as institutional capture. This is 22 years ago. Also 2002, you had that, I think, fairly well-known letter from some of the people at the Tavistock Portman Clinic, which said, and it bears reading out, so this was 8 of the clinicians at the Tavistock. They said in a letter to The Guardian, the experience of many psychiatrists, psychoanalysts and psychotherapists working with transsexual patients is that they are individuals who, for complex reasons, need to escape from an intolerable psychological reality into a more comfortable fantasy. By attempting to live as a member of the opposite sex, they try to avoid internal conflict which may otherwise prove too distressing. It's a measure of the urgency and desperation of their situation that they frequently seek surgery to make their fantasy real. By carrying out a sex change operation on their bodies, they hope to eliminate the conflict in their minds. Unfortunately, they said, what many patients find is that they are left with a mutilated body, but the internal conflicts remain. This is clinicians at the Tavistock in 2002 writing to The Guardian. So they knew what they were doing. 2003, we started work on the Gender Recognition Bill. Christian Institute worked with Baroness O'Cahoyne, who tabled 30 amendments to try to improve and just to challenge that bill. We were briefing peers, but when it came to it, we lost the vote, 155 to 57. The bill went through. Interestingly, John Bercow, remember him? He was one of the MPs that supported it. And he made a point of telling the Commons that he hadn't had a single letter from a constituent supporting the bill, but he was going to support it anyway. The minister who led the bill through at that time was David Lammy, who recently said that he thinks that men can be given drugs to grow a cervix. Bless him, indeed. But the legal fiction that bill created was that you could change your birth certificate to say that I could change my birth certificate to say I was born female. Well, British Social Attitudes Survey 2016 found that 58% of people supported the idea that you can change your sex on your birth certificate. By 2023, that figure had fallen to 24%. So during peak trans, that figure collapsed. And so the more people see of trans ideology, the less they like it. So we are regaining ground. The Conservatives and Labour have been forced to catch up with it to a greater or lesser extent. Sex realism has gone from being mainstream to fringe, and it's back in the mainstream again. And a lot of the people who've kind of put it there are pro-trans people who have been mugged by reality. They've seen the detransitioners. They've seen what's happening to autistic girls. They've seen the predators in women's prisons. They've seen what's happening in sports and the cancellation. And of course, the recovery of sex realism is being led by brave people, some of whom are in this room. But we should be thankful that we've got the Cass report. We should be thankful that we've got people like Kemi Badenoch on the Conservative front bench, Wes Streeting on the Labour front bench, who get this. So now is not the time for us to give up. There is this fight to be had on the plans to legislate on so-called conversion therapy, which would make it illegal not to support a child's transition. But the good news is that Scotland, Ireland, Sweden, the Netherlands, Finland, Western Australia, Austria have all tried and failed to create a workable legal definition of conversion therapy. And that is a winnable argument. It's an unnecessary law and, in fact, an impossible law. The biggest risk of losing ground again on this issue is self-censorship. But there's nothing more obvious than the fact that a man cannot become a woman. And we need to keep on saying that. And we also can't just treat all trans-identifying people the same. You have the sympathetic category of gender-distressed and gender-confused people, and they are not the same as narcissistic campaigners, and they're not the same as sexual predators. So we have to be allowed to treat those categories differently. And of course, the dispute is not over whether we help Category 1 sympathy people, it's how to help them. But the fact is that we're winning, regaining ground, because reality is on our side.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Simon. That history lesson was very useful and a timely reminder, but also I think some of the things that you proposed or raised, I think will give us plenty to discuss in the discussion part of this. Fiona, your thoughts, please.
Well, I want to talk about three things: the success of the feminist movement, biological reality, and male violence. The first female driver of a London tube train was in 1978. Joe's mentioned why that was possible, the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act. It took until 1991, which is well within the lifetime of almost everyone in this room, before rape in marriage was made illegal. So finally, that meant that a woman is a full human being with autonomy over her own body. Yes, even a married woman. But there was still a lot to do. Female representation in politics, for example, and we're still nowhere on that, are we? But the principle was agreed. And when I was a young woman, I thought the sex war was all over bar the shouting. In fact, there were even some special measures allowed to try and close the gap. Things like women's prizes, women's scholarships. So that's the relative success up to, say, 20 years ago of the feminist movement. And then the second thing is biological reality. We can be intellectually equal. Some women may be stronger than some men, who knows? But the reality is that on average, men are bigger and stronger than women, and that's why sometimes we need different treatment. For example, separate sports categories, because without that, women would almost never win. Again, that didn't used to be controversial. Do not believe any of that nonsense about women closing the gap. One woman won an ultramarathon, so now men can box women. No. In boxing, by the way, the difference between male and female of the same skill and the same weight, so in the same weight class, the difference between the sexes is equivalent to 8 weight classes. Yeah, you can't train your way out of that. That's biological reality. And that takes me to my third point, which is male violence. And in particular, male sexual violence against women. I don't know why most violence is by men, but it is. Of those prosecuted for violent crimes...
Hold on.
Do you want me to stop?
No, it's all right. You're going to carry on, but... No, that's fine. You carry on. Some people are prats no matter what you do with them. But anyway, carry on.
Okay, so of those prosecuted for violent crimes... in the UK, 91% are men, and for sexual crime, it's 98%. Men are also victims, of course, and hashtag not all men, of course, but women have much less chance of fighting off a male attacker, and that's why it worries us so much more. So even though women tend to avoid the behaviours that might put us at risk, things that men do, like being in gangs, getting into fights, walking or running late at night, telling complete strangers when they tell you to smile to just do one, these are all things women tend to avoid because we do not want to provoke someone who's likely to be able to win in a fight with us. But we're still at risk. And just to be clear, for every reported male victim of rape, there are at least 10 female reports of rape. So, you know, the ratio is, the data are there, as Joe will know. So we have to remember this because it's one reason why we have single-sex spaces as standard across society and indeed across the world. Anywhere where strangers mix. It's a good, sensible thing. And that was never contested. And yes, it's for privacy and dignity, not just safety. And men also value those things, and typically, for example, don't want a man walking in, don't want women walking in on them when they're having a pee, you know, those new gender neutral with urinals that nobody was asking for. But you understand that for women and girls, it's even more important. And somehow that fundamental understanding is being eroded now because of some men's feelings. This is terrifying to me and for my daughter. I did not realise how much ground we had lost. Before we even gained equality, you know, exactly as Joe said, we're losing territory on multiple fronts. And in effect, we're being asked to make the case all over again for why we need single-sex provision. Even in sport, we're expected to negotiate over how much we can get back. So, you know, to compromise, to give up some of the territory that was ours by right, like being allowed to play sport in male-free teams and changing rooms. So in cricket, this week we heard the settlement from the ECB is that the top women can have fairness, but the other 99% cannot. That is not progress. So, could there be an end to the gender wars? Well, what would that look like? I think it would look like the idea that flared briefly in the 90s, well, that's when I remember it, and then faded. When there's no need for gender pay gap reporting, or women's prizes, or all women shortlists. And yet it seems to me that those modest successes achieved by feminism have been overtaken by a new threat. And now we're having to fight just to be allowed to define ourselves. The fight for women's rights, going way back to the suffragettes and before, started with fighting to be heard. In this round of the gender wars, everyone listens to the men who claim to be women, while carefully not listening to the other women, almost as if they know the difference. The gains of feminism are being undone by infiltration rather than by direct challenge. And some women are helping the infiltrators. Now, we in the UK have put up a good fight. We fought off self-ID twice. The conversation is out in the open, and that's critical. It gives us a chance of resisting more bad legislation and changing bad policies. We've had a lot of gains lately. 3 years ago, every sport in the UK except boxing allowed men into women's events. Now about half of women and girls who play sport across the UK do it in a category that is protected for them. And that's partly because athletics, cycling and swimming are the big three by participation, and they've all done that. And there's more to come. But I'm sorry to say, to me, that doesn't mean we're winning. It means we're regaining some lost ground, but we're still way behind where we were 20 years ago. In the current battle, exactly as Joe says, I think we in the UK have largely stemmed the losses, and we have reversed a few, and it feels to us as if the tide is turning. But across the USA and Canada, violent men are still being put in women's prisons. Self-ID has just been introduced in Germany and in some Australian states, so the turning tide isn't worldwide yet. So where does that leave us? My conclusion is that the gender wars will never be done. But we in the UK are leading the world in winning this round. That's the best we can do, and we can be proud of it.
I'd just like to thank Fiona for carrying on regardless. One thing that always amuses me about the medically distressed, vulnerable young people is the narcissistic, nasty, harassing behaviour that they present so frequently. How weird is that? Bev. Now, Bev did ask me to ask earlier who was in the, and I forgot, who was in the Queering of Society session. Oh, and yes. Only a handful.
Oh, not so many.
Yes.
Excellent.
Right, good. That there was a reason. But anyway, Bev, your thoughts, please.
Thank you. So we don't all want to agree with each other, so I'll start off by disagreeing with Joe, that I think I think war is a good metaphor for where we are, and I think Fiona just proved it, because people who try to make a compromise, like this ridiculous cricket decision, because you've got to be nice. Well, let's be nice down here, and then we'll be fair up here. No, it doesn't work. Yeah, there is only one solution, which is to recognise reality. So this is a war not between men and women. It's not a war between right and left. It isn't a war between cis and trans, whatever those two things may mean. But it is true that women's rights have been undermined tremendously, and lesbians, as you know, are women squared. And so, above all, what we're witnessing has been a war against lesbians. So it's a war, I would say, between people who acknowledge material reality and are not afraid to say so, and against the proselytizers of a new religion. So I think by now the UK public is more or less aware there's a conflict of rights between believers in universal gender identity and non-believers, especially the rights of women and girls. And what is called contemptuously or affectionately, depending on where you stand, Turf Island, leads the way, as Fiona said, not only in our dozens of legal victories, but most importantly in the growing awareness that telling children that they can or should or change sex and encouraging them to change their bodies is a truly harmful and, you might say, evil practice. The Cass Review has had a real impact also internationally. But even here, we should not be complacent. One of the new services, for instance, set up to replace the abysmal GIDS clinic, the Nottingham Young People's Gender Service, is just simply disregarding Cass and states that care should be gender affirming in line with WPATH. You may have heard of WPATH. It presents itself as a scientific medical body, and of course it is simply an activist organisation. It's recently been exposed, the lies and the activism which pass for medical expertise. It's been completely discredited, and yet the NHS is still following many WPATH guidelines. And its most recent standards of care has a whole chapter about children who are born eunuchs and boys who are born eunuchs, and they should be helped to be castrated so that their gender identity is aligned with their sex, well, with their bodies, whatever. Anyway, we cannot insulate ourselves, whatever we're achieving here in the UK, and I am proud of it. We cannot insulate ourselves from the rest of the world, which in some respects is moving in the opposite direction. The UN is so enthralled to gender identity ideology that when it's Women's Day, we have to celebrate trans women. When it's International Lesbian Day, we have to accept the fact that, of course, trans lesbians, which are heterosexual men, just in case you didn't know, are also lesbians. This is the UN. The only person who ever speaks out at the UN for women's rights is Reem Al-Salem. She is the Special Rapporteur for violence against women and girls, and she has been absolutely intrepid, and she is attacked within the UN and from outside the UN every single time she speaks, and she carries on, and she's a hero of mine. Even CEDAW, you may have heard of CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Even at CEDAW, the committee is saying yes, but we have to include those trans women as well, because, even though it says on the basis of sex at the beginning of CEDAW. To a large extent, our children don't grow up in the UK. We should remember that. They grow up online. They grow up on YouTube. They grow up on TikTok. And they see there the genderist propaganda from the United States, where most Democrats still believe that some children are born in the wrong body, and the only people who would deny them the medicine they need, these poor children who are born in the wrong body, are absolute evil bigots like me. Yes, we do think that they should not be given this medicine because it has been proved beyond doubt that it causes immense harm, and there is no evidence at all that it does any good. So I'm going to rush through the Netherlands, I'm going to rush through the EU, and I want to say, how does this new religion, as Andrew Doyle describes it so eloquently, conquered the world so rapidly? I think it's been because it's largely been driven by so-called LGBTQ organisations, those once lovely groups that gave us gay rights and same-sex marriage. Having achieved gay marriage, they all shifted to promoting gender identity instead. How to explain to people, and we'd have to explain it, that those groups are the ones doing harm to gay and lesbian people. And let me just blow my own trumpet, because when Kate Harris, just wave your hand a bit, when Kate and I started off at LGB Alliance, we were the first gay rights organisation in the world to stand up against gender identity ideology, and that is why we have been vilified since the beginning. It was strange, having pursued progressive causes all my life, to start being called a hateful bigot. I've got used to it. I wish I hadn't had to get used to it. So the UK is edging slowly towards a saner approach, but all international organisations, Amnesty International, the UN, is moving in the opposite direction. So is the Council of Europe, the European Union. So please, I would ask you to do things if you want to help. One is engage internationally. That means, for instance, protesting to international agencies that downgrade the UK because it's supposedly unfriendly to LGBTQ plus people. And second, I hope everyone will stop saying LGBT. Like the acronym BAME, which has now been dropped by the UK government, the collection of letters conceals differences. Worse than BAME, it conceals a conflict between gay and lesbian rights and the demands of the genderati. It suggests we are all part of one community. We are not. There is nothing in common between a confused teenage girl and a middle-aged man who decides that he is now a woman. These people have nothing in common. It is not a community. That is to say that trans people are not a community, and LGB are certainly not a community with the TQ+. Sexual orientation is about sex, not gender identity, whether or not a person has a gender recognition certificate. No one is sexually attracted to a piece of paper. Until we can root out this damaging forced teaming, we cannot win the gender wars.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot. Stephen, your thoughts? And I know it's hot in here, by the way.
Yeah, so I strongly believe that we should approach the problem of gender ideology through the perspective of religious freedom, or more importantly, freedom from religion. Gender ideology is just another irrational, faith-based worldview, albeit a young and godless one. It operates like any fundamentalist religion, and we are all being coerced into attending its church. Like any fundamentalist religion, free speech is the first thing to go. We see this in the mantra of no debate, which is preached to us from the pulpits of the most influential trans activist organisations. Women obviously get the short straw from religion, and this new gender religion is no exception, as it erodes away the hard-won rights to single-sex spaces. You'll also have noticed it's very quick to dish out violence, threats and intimidation whenever women attempt to gather in public and speak freely about this issue. Fundamentalists used to call these women witches, and now they call them TERFs. Gender ideology is also brazenly anti-science, much in the way young Earth creationism is. The central tenets of this ideology completely contradict science, in fact. It preaches that human sex exists on a spectrum, rather than the clear male or female binary that it is. And in the most egregious way, in my opinion, it also teaches to small children that it's possible to be born in the wrong body, something akin to a gendered soul. You cannot, of course, be born in the wrong body. You are your body. The disciples of genderism, is it genderati? I'm going to steal that. The disciples of genderati. The disciples of genderism also have their own blasphemy codes. They don't use the word blasphemy, of course. They kind of backdoor it in with words like transphobia, dead naming, misgendering, things like that. But there is good news. Just like any worldview that's completely untethered from reality, it will eventually implode under the weight of its own demands for purity and inevitably descend into sectarianism. Because even the most devout disciples of gender ideology cannot hope to satisfy its ever-changing commandments and dogmas. Just take a moment to consider the fact that the leadership of Pink News has just recently been accused of transphobia by former staff and their own readership. So, I mean, what chance do the rest of us have if Pink News aren't considered pious enough? I'm actually quite annoyed with Pink News on a personal level. They once ran an article about me that described me as, and I quote, an anti-trans YouTuber. I couldn't believe it. A fucking YouTuber. So there is good news. Like I said, it will implode under the weight of its own inconsistencies. But the obsession with controlling our language is also a staple of devout authoritarianism. In Orwell's 1984, the party believes that the revolution will be complete just as soon as the language is perfect. So if we all just agree to announce our pronouns, accept the label cis, and memory hold the word women in place of terms like birthing people, menstruators, we will finally enter a sort of gender paradise. These impositions are actually sold to us under the guise of politeness and inclusivity. Yet you'll notice how quickly those principles of politeness and inclusion go out the window the moment you resist. Because this has nothing to do with being inclusive and everything to do with control. They think that if they can control how we speak, they can control how we think. But unlike more esoteric problems, gender ideology has one huge weakness at its core. And it's this: we all know what a man and a woman is. This ability to distinguish between the sexes is innate and has been gifted to us by thousands upon thousands of years of human evolution. Yet the party is telling us to reject the evidence of our eyes and ears. My home team of atheism won't save us either. Organised atheism has been utterly useless on this issue too, especially stateside. When children were being taught in schools that the Earth was only 6,000 years old and that Charles Darwin was wrong, atheist activists were rightly incensed. Yet if you teach those same children that human beings can change sex, or they may have been born in the wrong body, these same atheist organisations go missing, or worse, excommunicate Richard Dawkins for noticing the problem. The answer to these issues is not an atheist utopia, nor a resurgence of monotheism. The answer is good, old-fashioned, staunch secular liberalism. And it's these very principles that rightly afford trans people the rights that everyone has, whilst also empowering the rest of us to say, I do not wish to participate in your identity or beliefs. So I think I need to be clear that my criticism of trans ideology shouldn't be misinterpreted as an attack on trans people. The overwhelming majority of people causing trouble in this area are non-trans activists anyway. And just as we are clear to distinguish between decent Muslims and Christians from the fundamentalists within their faith, we should also distinguish between the deranged activist and the trans people who want to live their lives without any desire to impose anything on anyone. So to finish on an optimistic note, yes, the end is in sight, but it isn't a problem that will take care of itself. It's going to take every one of us finding the confidence to say no thank you, wherever this ideology finds you, and it will find you. Now, I imagine the kind of people here today are not particularly shy about speaking their mind. However, some of you may still be quietly waiting for that perfect moment to stick your head above the parapet. You may be living a double life where you keep your gender opinions to yourself until you get home. I call this the observe on the streets and turf in the sheets mentality. You may think that the huge scandals that have rocked the headlines, such as the Tavistock or Cass Review or male prisoners being housed with women, or the fact that a man just won a gold Olympic medal for punching women in the face. You think that might have been the tipping point, but the truth is these scandals will just keep coming if people that understand the problem continue to bite their tongue. So now is the time to look the disciples of gender ideology in the eye and let them know you are a non-believer. More people agree with you than you know. So I'll quickly leave you with some encouragement from the great late Christopher Hitchens, who said, never be a spectator of unfairness or stupidity. The grave will supply plenty of time for silence. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Some great quotes in there, aren't there, to use. But anyway, over to you, audience. Let me see who wants to speak, who wants to get us going. Okay, so I've got 4 hands. I'll take them in the order. So I've got you, and then I'll come to you, and then you.
Hi, Claire Mendelsohn. It's a very short question. I'd like to know what the panel and specifically Joe think about trans-identifying males who commit crimes being statistically recorded as female.
Okay, thank you. So we've got somebody, sorry, in the front row here, and then I'll go.
Thank you very much. Stephen, I thought you were spot on.
Thank you.
And Simon, thank you for reading my letter.
Sorry.
I've been sticking my head above the parapet for the past 24 years, and what I've found is that whenever you talk to anybody, they always see sense. And there's this prevailing idea of all these captured organisations that my first paper was comparing trans ideology to the Emperor's New Clothes, where everybody is just a bit scared to point out what they really believe. And what I want to know is, why are all these organisations so scared of upsetting a small number of people? It seems ridiculous. And I totally agree with the LGBT thing. I mean, when was the last time you ever saw ITV, BBC, Channel 4 referring to a gay person? They don't. They refer to an LGBTQ person. But why are they all so scared? That was my point.
Okay, thank you. And then, there in the middle. Wait, you might as well wait to the microphone. You've been waiting to get in.
Hi, well, thanks for letting me have my free speech. I'd like to say, I think freedom of speech in universities, all for that. Fairness in sport, brilliant. Lesbians should have their own spaces based on biological sex. I'm not here to cause anybody problems. If somebody wants to ask me a question as a trans woman, I'm happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you. No. To be honest, fair enough, right? Fair enough. Right, okay. Move. No, I won't be able to find you because you've gone. But anyway, there you go, yeah.
Hi, I'm Louise Irvin. I'm the co-chair of Clinical Advisory Network on Sex and Gender. And I think it's really, I think what Joe said about this isn't just an ideological fight, this has actually real implications for people. And I'm thinking especially of children and young people who are being subjected to not just gender ideology, but actual hormones and irreversible changes. Now, I think that there's almost too much of Cass is great. I helped with the BMA letter to get the BMA to change their minds and all that. So, totally supportive. But we have to be aware that even with the Cass review, they're still talking about doing experimental research on giving puberty blockers to pubertal children, which I don't think there's any possibility of an ethical trial that can actually effectively answer the questions that need to be asked. They're still giving hormones testosterone to 16-year-old girls on a large scale across the UK. The capture of the UK health institutions, you're talking about the CQC, or the Royal College, most of the Royal Colleges, medical schools, trusts, the GMC, Department of Health and Social Care and NHS England. I'm just saying, I think we've got a long way to go to eradicate gender identity ideology from healthcare, especially as it impacts children, notwithstanding Cass.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. That's helpful. So I've got this lady here. So I don't know how many. If you go there, sorry, and then if you go to that gentleman standing there, and then I'll kind of work around. Yeah, go on, you. No, in the front row. You had your hand up. No one in the front row. That gentleman there. You carry on. God knows what I was looking at. Right.
Oh, me. Okay.
Yeah.
First of all, I haven't really heard much of a battle here. I feel like it's just everybody agreeing with each other in terms of what we are discussing. I feel like there is lack of empathy or understanding or recognition of trans issues. For example, there was a... Can I just finish my point?
Yes.
There was a point made that nobody asked for unisex toilets, where many trans people have asked. And there are unisex toilets on the ground floor, and there's plenty of segregated toilets within that building. And I wonder whether anybody noticed or had an issue with that. So I just don't see we are listening or hearing their issues at all, at least in this room maybe. In terms of, the satisfaction rates, I think it's been reported that for transition it's 1 to 2%, whereas for niqab replacement it could be from 60 to 30% the satisfaction rate, but we are not debating niqab replacement surgery.
Thank you. I know that everyone's... But these are things which, outside of this room, are commonly argued, commonly said, and perfectly reasonably raised. That's my view. If people want to answer them, that's fine. That's the deal. Right, anyway, who was it? I saw somebody... Oh, yes. there on the pill. Yeah? Yeah. Do you want to speak? And then I've got, put your hand up if you want to speak so I'll just see who you are. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think we have a very real problem in the NHS and all of the institutions in medicine. There's no doubt at all. Everyone's paying lip service to CAS, but unfortunately on the ground, things are carrying on as usual. I mean, people may have read that article, I think it was in the Telegraph, that Nottinghamshire has just put out an advert for a psychologist to come into a service which is propagating affirmative gender care and are following the WPATH standards of care number 8, which I think people have already mentioned, is pretty iniquitous. So there's certainly a fight there, and it relates to the point about how can people not see reality and not see the damage that they are doing to children and young people. And I think the thing that we have to remember is that transgender ideology is pretty far-reaching and pretty iniquitous, and they have a lot at stake. I don't think we can underestimate what is at stake for transgender activists, not necessarily transgender people in general. For transgender activists, these fights are a matter of validating their existence. So the more that they recruit vulnerable children and young adults into their groups, the more they convince these young people that the only way to deal with their unhappiness and distress is in fact transition, then I think we really underestimate just how much of a fight it is. But the NHS is a real problem, and certainly I think for anybody in the NHS, we have got to consolidate that opposition that is beginning to exist.
Thanks, Jenny. Dr. Cunningham was speaking this morning, but there's also a session on medical ethics tomorrow morning on from WPATH to CAS, so I think these issues will come up. That was very helpful. Look, panel, I'm going to whiz across, then I'm going to start out again. I wasn't just being, I have to be very school teachery sort of saying what I said before, but I do think that people do get in a tangle when I go and talk to schools and universities, not necessarily about this issue, but about free speech. There is this sort of idea, oh, you just got no empathy for trans people. You don't get it, right? But I think that kind of untangling that, what that means, the different trans categories on the one hand, the difference between trans ideology and trans activism and trans, all of these things I think are helpful things that we might want to develop our public rhetoric around in terms of the way we understand it. Or am I being too soft, which people will often say? So that's something for you to all consider. But Jo, anything you want to pick up from what you've heard so far?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I shall declaim. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So the statistics, they are really, 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 really important, right? There is one thing that we know after, 200 years of robust evidence, and that's men commit more crime than women do. And because women commit so little crime, particularly if you look at sexual violence, the second you get two people, just two, the number 2 people into that, it begins to corrupt the statistics quite profoundly. So, yeah, we need to make sure that when we record sex, we record sex. You can see it in stark form if you look at the comparison of sex offending in Canada versus here. So Canada does a self-identification form of recording offences. Their sexual offending statistics for women are up around 7%. Everywhere else in the world, 2% or thereabouts. So tremendously important. I just want to say 2 more very quick things. In terms of a lack of empathy, I have yet to meet anyone in this movement who has a lack of empathy. In fact, it is the fact that people do empathize. They recognize the distress and the challenges that people who want to dress how they wish, identify how they wish, face. What we don't recognise, however, and we don't feel empathy for, is when that desire to be oneself imposes on other people's rights to speak, to have a job, etc. And I just want to touch on one last thing, and I've heard a lot of people talk about getting rid of or eradicating or somehow removing trans or gender ideology. That's not going to happen. You can't get rid of an idea. What we need to be focusing on is how we change the political and the policy environment. Because I could never stand on a platform and say, I want to get rid of this idea. It's bad. So that's all.
Okay, thank you. No, that's very useful. Yeah.
Yeah, first of all, as Hakeem, I'm sorry I didn't realise that you were one of the signatories of the letter that I read out, so I apologise for that, and it was a very important letter. As his question about why are people so scared, I mean, I don't know, but I think that, firstly, this issue came up and a lot of people just weren't prepared. They didn't see it coming, and so the activists got there and they established their narrative, and a lot of people went, okay, if you say so, because that's all they had to go on. And once that had been established, the next problem is, in my opinion, you've got a very narrow political class, but a very narrow range of a kind of people, a very narrow range of views. And so these kind of ideologies, if we're going to call it that, can kind of take over or at least dominate that political class quite quickly. And then you add to that sort of Britishness, if I can say that people just don't like to offend people. And I've been in so many situations where you say something perfectly reasonable and then somebody reacts like you've just called for genocide, and you think, I must have got something wrong. You blame yourself. But actually, you know, a lot of the time you've said nothing wrong. They are overreacting in order to get you to kind of freak out. So I think, I think fear has been a huge factor and has led to a groupthink. I think that's one of our problems. I want to speak to the issue of empathy as well. I mean, I tried to say in my own fumbling way that if you have people who are gender dysphoric or for other reasons, gender confused, I said that they're category 1, the most sympathetic category of people. And I think everybody in here would agree with that. And what I was trying to say was that the question, the debate amongst us is not whether we help these people, it's how we help these people. And I think that life-wrecking drugs and surgery are not a compassionate response.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I want to say two things. So this strand at the Battle of Ideas is about women's freedoms, and I believe I talked entirely about women's issues, and I don't think I said the T word once. And I don't think there's any other movement in our society that the response when you advocate for yourselves is, but what about the men? And I'm sick of it. So I'm sorry, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. Having said that, I noticed Simon talking about empathy for people who experience distress. I've heard questions in the audience about, and from Bev, about the implications of misguided healthcare, the implications of lack of thought in what is the right way to help particularly gender or confused or distressed children. And we know from the Cass review that their distress about their gender or what sex they are is typically a symptom and not a sign of some misalignment of body and soul. So I agree with what Simon said. We are largely about making sure that everybody's rights are properly respected and that nobody's temporary distress is parlayed into some devastating lifelong impact for them just to suit other people's beliefs.
Thank you very much.
Just a few things. Why are people scared? I ran a little Twitter poll on that once. I know Twitter polls are not really worth much, but I was quite surprised to discover that more than half of people said they were afraid of losing their jobs. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the other fear, of course, is that your loved ones, your friends, your family may think. Simon was saying that you've said something horrendous, and you start doubting yourself. And it takes a long. I remember one woman who was totally thought that we were horrible bigots, and then she was unemployed, and she spent 4 months reading, and she came back and she said, "Sorry, I got that completely wrong." Anyway. I wanted to address something about the clinical trials. We are worried about the clinical trials, about how can you make this ethical? How can you make it ethical? Especially since they're now not calling it a clinical trial but a study. Does that matter that they call it a study? Does that make it easier to avoid an ethics committee? I don't know. Let's all keep our eyes on that because it's very worrying. But let's not have a knee-jerk reaction. First, want to see what's proposed before a considered response. And then one more point about the surgery regret. There are a few things that are trundled out quite frequently. One is that if you don't give your child puberty blockers, they will kill themselves. The National Advisor for Suicide Prevention, Louis Appleby, got quite angry about this because it is completely false. It is completely false, and people have to stop saying it. In fact, the reverse is true. Suicide rates are either equal or worse after transition. So please, if anybody says it, just correct it. And the thing is about a 1% regret is complete nonsense. Every single survey that seems to show that there's something completely wrong with it, either it was done with men 30 years ago, no relevance to the teenage girls that want it now, or they only call it regret when you've changed your name back and changed your body back, which of course hardly anybody ever does. So it's complete. The recent surveys suggest something like 30% or upward.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
Yeah, just 2 quick points. So just back to this idea of empathy again. I think it's quite easy to accuse the people on the other side of the debate of being kind of empathy-less and like pantomime villains. And I would imagine most people on this side of the debate are motivated heavily by empathy for the irreversible damage caused to children and the people caught up in this ideology. So, gender-distressed kids deserve all the compassion and support that can be afforded to them. It's just that we don't want the extremists to dictate exactly what that support looks like. And into this idea of not being able to eradicate an idea, I completely agree. I think the best we can hope for really is to get to the point where somebody announces these gender kooky beliefs and it's treated within the same way as someone announcing that they're a flat earther or a Lib Dem voter, something like that. So we're looking for like intellectual termination of these ideas rather than eradication, I would say.
It's very entertaining.
One of the things about why people don't speak out, and it sort of also relates to what one of the things Bev was saying about one of the myths that this will lead to young people taking their own lives, which, by the way, I think is the most disgusting, unempathetic thing you're going to say to young people, which is if the adults in the room don't give you what you demand now, that will make you suicidal. I mean, it doesn't take a psychological genius to know that that's not good for people's mental health and might make them feel a bit fragile. Well, one of the reasons about people not speaking out was when you saw that guy from the Samaritans the other day, because he tweeted, he's basically been kicked out as a Samaritans volunteer. Samaritans, the suicide helpline that stops people killing themselves, won't have somebody in, not because of anything he said on a call, but because of what he posted on X. And then he discovered that they are basically doing training run by gendered intelligence. Exactly. Some people in the room know what that means. But what I mean is, I do think that that's what happens when things get corrupted. You end up defensively saying, I don't want young people to kill themselves. And in fact, it's so far from the reality, it's almost like the men aren't women and women aren't men discussions. You feel like, that was my point at the opening this morning, you're constantly being gaslit like that, and it drives me mad. But anyway, I've got somebody in the front there, then that gentleman there, then you.
I'm not very empathetic at all, but seriously. The point I wanted to make was about how I'm not entirely sure that we're winning this, whether we call it a war or not, as much as is being put over. And I just want to say why I think there's a problem with this, because I think there's a really kind of insidious colonization of institutions and language that is very, very difficult to challenge. I'm the chair of trustees for a local museum in a small town of Faversham, which is basically a local museum with a load of old stuff in it. And a lot of well-meaning, generally elderly volunteers who are running it, and some of the stuff is actually quite precious. It's quite important, and we might want to lend it to other museums. So we have to be registered and accredited. But one of the questions in the accreditation form was, demonstrate that your museum is LGBTQ plus led. How do you do that? Now, the point is that this is bonkers. I mean, there was a question about whether it was women-led, and I said rather jokingly, well, you can say the chair's a woman, but I don't lead that body as a woman. I lead it as somebody who's interested in local history and so on. So the point that but with the LGBTQ plus thing, it's even more insane. And I don't know how we really challenge that embeddedness. This is the Arts Council, I think, that's generally behind this. But that remains even in the face of what I think is the reality check. So how do we deal with that?
Okay. Good question. So I've got somebody here. Yeah, you got the thing. Somebody here next. No, you first, and then that person. Yeah.
Yes, I think the public is very confused by this issue because they don't really see any difference between the terms sex and gender, and the terms are very confusing because, as far as I can work out from what I read in the newspapers, people take sex to be what you're born with by the genitals you have when you're born, whereas gender is often, in this context, considered to be how you feel. Well, this is actually completely wrong scientifically. I mean, gender means that you have chromosomes, you have either XY or YY, and as far as I know, the chromosomes, as far as I know, can't be changed. That's for life. And except in very, very rare cases, the chromosomes correspond to the genitals that babies have at birth. Therefore, well, I think everybody talking about this, they should make it quite clear what they mean by sex and what they mean by gender.
Yeah. That's all too sensible. What are you talking about? That's yes, we know that, but that's not the way you can have the... I'm not joking with you. What I mean is, perfectly reasonable, but you can't say that now without anyone going, what are you talking about? That's what's so ridiculous. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention how difficult it is for parents. Obviously it's very difficult for parents where they have children who want to transition, but difficult when you've got girls who, just get very angry when you try to discuss this issue with them. They feel that they really want to sort of help trans people. They're very on side. So Christmas, I've got two girls of 20, 21, 3 nieces, all under the age of 24, who get really angry, start crying. It's really hard to... So Bev talked about, how children are growing up, and there's a generation. We can see the generation. If more people, maybe more young people spoke here, we might kind of see that there is this disconnect. And how do we try to, have that discussion without tears?
I think that's such an important point, by the way, just really. Right, so I know that Az wants to come in, but I want to say a couple of people who haven't spoken. So there's that lady there, but there's down here we've got, you and then the gentleman behind, Yeah, you, lady. Yeah, you, Sorry.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a point, really just a comment about even just speaking here now is a big deal for me to be here. Some of us are in professions where we really will lose our jobs potentially, and I appreciate that sometimes I oscillate between thinking, why don't more people speak up, and why don't people understand why I don't speak up? And I suppose I just wanted to make the point about power and who are we expecting to speak up and who needs to speak up, because it feels to me like the feminism I always knew and loved is kind of gone. And I know a lot of highly educated, financially secure women who would define themselves as feminists who don't really seem to care for some reason, about women on the margins. And I've worked in women's prisons, and I kind of feel concerned about women and children in specific groups who they don't seem to have the backing of women who have some power. So I suppose it's a question like, what happened? When did those women in power stop investing in a fight on behalf of other women?
Okay, very good question. Yes, that lady there.
Question.
Yeah, you. Have you got the mic? Oh no, okay. So that gentleman there, because he's got the mic, can that lady have the mic, and then we'll come round, yeah.
2 quick points. Adam Hibbert from Social Democratic Party. I just wanted to say, first of all, I'm one of those people who's been looking at this for a long time, but it's just immediately come into my personal life as well recently, with my daughter going up to a netball tournament where she was immediately thrown in versus a chap who's older and nastier than me. And it really brings it home. What was interesting about that experience was contacting English Netball and saying, what's going on here? They tell me I'm the first person that's contacted them with a lived experience, and they're trying, what I take away from this is they're really trying to build a kind of dossier of evidence that they can say, if they're challenged in court, look, this is how you have empathy for the 16-year-old girl who's meant to go up against a tank. And it's so I understand the kind of trouble that they're anticipating for all their little volunteer networks around the country who are going to get it in the neck when they try and impose this sensible, common sense line. I'd like to thank Fiona for reaching out on that issue, because that was extremely helpful. But taking a further step back, the SDP, we've had a policy on sex-based rights for 4 years now, which I'm immensely proud of. I think it's probably been the leading kind of party position on sex-based rights. We're updating it at the moment. We're looking at all of the discussion around the Equality Act and also the Gender Recognition Act, and trying to understand what is the right way to unpick this mess at the legal level. Because as long as we've got that legal superstructure, of course these little organisations can be terrified of being hauled in front of the court and basically made bankrupt, right? We've got to fix that superstructure. I'd be really interested to understand. Personally, I think we have to adjust both those acts. But I'd be interested to have a bit of commentary on what we can do to that policy.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. So, yes, you. So, there's a person right at the back, and then I've got two in the front there. Right. Yes, you've got the mic. You stand up at the back who wanted to speak a minute ago. Yeah, you. Yeah.
So to the man over there who asked why people are so scared of speaking out, I think one part of your question was why companies are, really virtue signalling and they're not afraid, that they are afraid to speak out. So the reason for that is because, so when you walk through Oxford Street during Pride Month, every single shop has, a Pride flag in the window. And the reason for that is because the three largest investment companies in the world, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street Bank, they're funding the majority of these shops and, establishments. And they fund them on the condition that they promote the LGBT community. And if they stop, then they get their funding removed. So they're afraid of losing their funding, basically. My question to you is, do you think there's a greater agenda at play, or is it just purely virtue signalling? As someone who was a victim of this brainwashing from a very young age, I was convinced I was a lesbian for years. I didn't even look at men at all, because in my assembly in school, I was told that 1 in 3 of us will be gay when we're older, and I fell for that. And I began to think, what if it's me? So do you think there's a greater agenda at play?
Oh. We all know that, right? Thank you. And also, whether you can be brainwashed into thinking you're a lesbian or not is another question, rather than that. So I'll let somebody else deal with that. Right, so that person's got their hands up, but that person's got the microphone. But you two are next, I know. You two, and I haven't forgotten you. Then I'm going to come to the panel, then we finish it before we all faint. And not because we're women who are having fainting fits, but because it's bloody hot. Right, yes.
Just a suggestion to the SDP.
Speak louder into the mic.
Just a suggestion to the gentleman from the SDP and anyone else. Something that I'm thinking of from seeing in schools is challenging people who are saying, no, you can't do this, or are stopping people from making a decision to actually complain or argue against something, is to say, what about your liability insurance and the underwriters? Because ultimately they're the ones that are going to make the decision, and they're not stupid. They know that they cannot afford to pay if you were to take them to court if your daughter was injured in a netball match. But I think the issue is many of those people that are the barriers to or the gatekeepers towards the underwriters are not even thinking that women or the advocates of women will even challenge legally, because we don't historically. So I think that's where the issue is. So we've got to start talking about the underwriters of any of those areas, and then that will hopefully get them to start thinking.
Okay, because that person's got the mic, I'm taking them. Thank you, that was very useful. You speak, you two get the mic.
Just a suggestion on the definition issue that was raised, and also on what to say to children, and I also say it to other people as well, is to just say, well, they're correct. It's a social construct, gender is, and it only exists for the people that believe in it. And that's it.
Okay, thank you. Good advice. Thank you.
Hi, it's actually just me. My friend sitting next to me was just supporting my hand going up. On the basis of sort of the importance of know thy enemy, I'm still really curious about how this gender ideology movement has gained so much traction so quickly. And I'm interested in the panel's view on that. I know, Bev, you said about LGBTQI plus organisations driving it, and maybe that's changed a lot. I'm sure that is part of it, but I worked in that sector for years, and we never had that much say or power back then. Or is it the patriarchy? I'd much rather be out campaigning against violence against women, or funding or giving donations to refugees rather than funding legal cases. Is it a distraction on that? Where does Big Pharma come in this? Where's the money coming from that's driving this movement? Just curious.
Okay, thanks. So I've got Az and I've got you and Az. So and then I'm going to ask the panel to round up, and then we'll kind of move on. Yeah.
Hi, I just have two quick points to make. The first is about statistics. For my day job, I chair domestic homicide reviews, and in situations where a trans woman kills a woman, it's listed as a woman killing a woman. So the statistics are completely skewed. You need to know that, and we need to be doing something about it. And my second point was around the clinical trials. At the moment, there is no upper limit of participants.
Thank you. You've elicited a number of wows in those 2 points, so thank you.
Negative.
Can we just have negative wows? Yeah.
My point is, rather than it being about empathy or not empathy, I think it's about thinking and not thinking. I mean, having devoted 24 years of my psychotherapy career thinking with trans people, you can't say I don't have any empathy, and my patients would dispute that too. Those of you who came to my talk earlier on neurodiversity and gender dysphoria, I said that those who would be considered transsexual are 100% on the autistic spectrum, not the transvestites or the fetishists, but the autistic ones are. And the point of the autistic brain is very difficult for them to tolerate differing perspectives or thinking patterns other than their own. So if you're an ally, you're agreeing with them. If you're not agreeing with them, then you hate them. And it's not about empathy, I think it's about thinking. So you're either able to think about it, or you just agree without thinking, which is what they want. And in the 24 years I've been doing this, and I've seen obviously quite a lot of them, you will never find a single person who says that they believe they're the opposite sex who can accurately, convincingly convey to you how and why they believe that, other than talking about what they look like.
Okay, very interesting. Yes, where's that person gone? Oh no, you've spoken. Are we done? Oh God, we're done. Oh no, quick. All right, now that don't go mad, but go on, quick.
It was to pick up on the point of the museums and the Vanguard and Black Rock. I think follow the money. A lot of a lot of companies, like for pensions, and everybody's got their pension money invested, and they have to kind of fill certain criteria now. I think it's ESG. It keeps changing numbers, and it's got various different criteria. Lots of them that would make a difference to the world are far too difficult, but the easy peasy ones are: do you have the communal toilets and tick, 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 and do you have an LGBT club? And that's gone everywhere. And that's all your pensions, all your money, follow the money.
Okay, thank you. Was it very quick, tiny quick? That lady there, tiny quick, yeah. And then panel, then me, then panel. Yeah.
So quick, sorry, I'm going to really annoy everyone. When that bloke stood up earlier, everyone's head swiveled. Fiona was speaking. It says free speech allowed. What he wants is for everyone to do that and ignore the woman who's speaking. When that happens again, I'm sure it will, because they're here, they're in, don't give them what they want. They want women to be quiet. They want women to not speak. It's not a mistake that he waited until a woman was speaking for him to stand up and do his little performance. When that happens again, ignore them. Listen to the woman who is speaking. Don't turn your head and give them all the attention that they so desperately crave. Sorry.
All right. Yeah, so listen, I just a few things. There's absolutely no way that this session can answer the question, how did this happen, satisfactorily. And in a way, it's an ongoing project that we need to keep discussing, because actually we do need to understand what's happened. I don't know, when we were talking earlier, and Bev said, who'd been at the queering of society. I mean, I'm going to I chaired that, I've chaired this, and I'm going to watch both of them again. Because actually in the queering of society, there was an attempt at understanding how how queering and queer studies has become normalised in everyday life, which is odd, you have to admit, right? So it's like, how did that happen? And that's even kind of broader than the T bit. It's the TQI plus God knows what, right? And so, I seriously think that we need to get better at understanding the world that we're in, and we need to be able to talk about it more openly. The other thing is that I do think that the question that was asked by somebody who says, I'm a parent of 2 daughters, and the cousins, they get together. This is genuinely true. You go into any sixth form or student union, you get the family round who are young, particularly women, young women in particular, and they are ashamed of you. They are ashamed of you that you don't understand, that you aren't empathetic. They think that it's you that's the problem, right? And it's very powerful, right? Because those of us who are old women wouldn't mind having a bit of support and be inspiring to young women, right? We want to be the people that they go, she's our heroine, not like she's a bigot. I mean, it's not good, is it? Immediately, it's mortifying. You're an old bigot who doesn't... It's like because then you remember when you were young and you had an old bigot aunt or whatever, right? And you think, oh my God, they think I'm like... Right, so I think there's a lot going on that makes people kind of stay stum. It's not good enough, by the way, it's not good enough. Also, we owe it to those young women to tell them they're talking rubbish. Yeah. It's just that you can't just go, you're talking rubbish. Because generally speaking, it's not very empathetic. But I do think that we owe it to those young women to say that they've been sold a pup. That's all I'd say. Yeah. But I can assure you, I'm not good enough at having that argument yet. But I try it. But I'm not good enough, right? And also, intellectually, I'm not able to account for all the things that have happened yet. And therefore, for my thing about is the gender war's over, the main thing is our work isn't over. Because if progressive politics, if women's rights campaigners, if those of us who fought on the Marxist left for years, all the rest of it, we had to do a bit of reading, a bit of work, a bit of intellectual work, Feminism's got so many sides to it, so many theories associated with it. But theories mean a lot of people have done a bit of thinking. So my view is the gender wars are not over, but our work is only just beginning, because we need to those young women need to be given a good account by us. Okay.
Yes.
Stephen, and whizzing across, give us your final thoughts and anything you want to say.
Yeah, very quickly. I empathise with that lady who raised the issue of how do parents navigate this issue. And the truth is that a lot of parents, decent people, made the right call when they were faced with a new challenge. They reached out to institutions, they reached out for medical help, and they were failed by that system because they were met with nothing but the gender affirmation model, and they were asked, would you prefer a dead son or a new daughter? And so these parents have been failed just as much as the children in this system, as the thousands of pieces of litigation against the Tavistock clinic will attest.
Thank you very much.
On the sex and gender, totally agree. When people say gender, they should say what they mean. Kathleen Stock has a good description of the 4 different meanings in the chapter 1 of her book, Material Girls. As far as girls, talking to girls and trying to have good discussions with girls who get angry, please, I recommend to you Gender a Wider Lens. Stella and Sasha have long podcasts about this issue, about how you can conduct these discussions in an empathetic way without upsetting people. Women in power, why don't they speak up? I think they look at J.K. Rowling, the wonderful J.K. Rowling, who is a woman in power, who has stood up, and look what they've done to her, but she carries on speaking up, and she is our champion. And just one more thing, the progress flag, that ugly thing, what it stands for is inclusion. Inclusion means women include men. It means, it stands for some lesbians have penises, and that's why we don't like it.
Yeah, so what we're talking about in different ways, I think the professional women and the young women is female socialisation, and that's what made me furious when someone told me I needed to worry about someone else rather than myself and my daughter. And I think that what we're doing is trying to centre that it is reasonable and not selfish and not unfeminine and doesn't make you nasty to think about your own needs sometimes. That's all we're saying. And I think that's the challenge to those girls is, but it's okay to worry about what it does for you as well as worry about them. And I think that some of those women, and I come across them in the world of sport, women with, CBEs and all sorts, they will talk about what's allowed in promoting women's sport. Oh, they'll go on and on about promoting women's sport, but they will not touch this issue because they've got where they've got by operating within the margins of what's acceptable, and that is very cowardly, and I don't forgive them, because they could speak up. Everyone else, I understand, you have to make your own calls. Final point, the woman who runs who's trustee of a museum, yeah, it is deeply embedded, and for a moment listening to you, I thought, oh God, maybe it is worse than I thought, but here's the thing, we will reach a tipping point when things will change very fast, and that will be because we know that if we can get people to have the courage to speak, and enough people speak, we know that the vast majority of people agree with us. So we have to get that point. So the answer to how do we get it out, how do we root it out, is we keep talking about it, those who can, because most people are for reality and common sense. And secondly, there's good old Operation Let Them Speak, because sometimes when they talk, they recruit people to the world of reality and common sense as well. So I'm still optimistic.
Okay, brilliant, thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to answer Anne's question about the museum thing as well, but I think Fiona's done such a good job. Also, the joblessness question. At the risk of sounding glib, it's so important that people know they're not alone in these situations. It's so important that we team up. It's important that we're prepared to donate money to help fight legal cases. And it's important that we celebrate the small wins, and there are plenty of them going on. And it's important that there's inspiration, and I think there's plenty of that at this conference.
Thank you very much indeed. Bev, quick.
Yeah, I just wanted to quick, there's one point I forgot to answer the lady who wanted to know about the money. There are more than 100 paediatric gender clinics in America. They make a lot of money. Paediatric gender transition is a growth industry now worth more than $1 billion. That's where it is. And the transhumanism industry is also contributing a lot of money. It's a growth industry.
Thank you very much. Jo.
I'll be very, very, very fast. As somebody who did stand up, I stood up simply because I knew that the younger colleagues I had who thought what I thought couldn't. But the only reason I could stand up was because all of you, many of you, put money in that Crowd Justice Fund. And whilst the battle may not be won on the legal front, the legal wins are very important because they strengthen the arm of other people. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Right. totally brilliant panel. I mean, I mean that. That was like worth it. And I just like to say is that while one young person decided that the way to draw attention was to wander back, we did allow another person to speak. And they didn't say anything very much, did they? So, I mean, when I say another person, somebody who might have come in to be disruptive, but made the point, and if you see, and said, come and talk to me, then left. But nonetheless, no, I'm just saying, we're not frightened of debate or discussion. Fine, make your point, go on with it. If you haven't got any point to make and you want to flounce off, that's you. Tomorrow morning, as Hakeem on detransitioning, about his book Detrans with respondents, followed by W Path to Cast, that's another session. And then we've got Stephen and his colleagues podcast with Rosie Duffield and Rosie Kay at the end of tomorrow. See you. Take care, everyone. Very good. Very good.